My girlfriend is acting obsessed with this random family she just met. Let me tell you, I'm in a real pickle, and I've got no clue what to do. I've been dating my girlfriend Maggie for just 3 short months. It was one of those serendipitous meet cuties that you only see in the movies. We bumped into each other at a local coffee shop. I was frantically trying to meet a work deadline, my laptop open, papers strewn all over the table, and a half-empty cup of cold coffee beside me. Maggie walked in, looking like a breath of fresh air. She had this infectious smile and a twinkle in her eye. We got to chatting while waiting in line for our drinks, and it turned out we had a shared love for indie music and obscure documentaries. Before I knew it, we'd exchanged numbers and were making plans to see each other again. The first few weeks were like a dream. We went on long walks in the park, hand in hand, stopping to feed the ducks and sharing ice cream cones. We'd stay up late talking on the phone, whispering sweet nothings, and laughing until our sides hurt. But then, this whole crazy situation reared its head and threw me for a loop. A few weeks back, Maggie landed a new job. She was over the moon about it, all fired up to meet new people and take on new challenges. She'd come home every evening, her eyes sparkling with excitement, regaling me with tales of her new office, the quirky colleagues, and the projects she was getting involved in. And she did, especially with this one coworker, Joe. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for Maggie having male friends. I've got my own gang of female buddies, and I know how important it is to have a diverse social circle. But the way Maggie and Joe hit it off was just odd. From what Maggie told me, she was sizing up her new colleagues, trying to figure out who was all about business and who she could let her hair down with. She described the office as a bit of a maze, with different personalities and cliques. And apparently, Joe was her go-to guy for the inside scoop. He was pointing out who was cool and who to avoid. But it just didn't sit right with me. I mean, she'd only known him for a hot minute, so why was she trusting him so implicitly? It was like they'd known each other for years. Pretty soon, I started hearing that they were hanging out a lot outside of work. That raised my eyebrows a bit, but then I found out they usually had Joe's wife and kids in tow. So, okay, cheating was probably off the table, but it was still super strange. Most folks don't bring near strangers into their kids' lives like that. It's like a whole different level of familiarity that just seemed out of place. I remember one evening, Maggie came home late. I'd been waiting up for her, a bit worried. When she walked in, she was all smiles and said she'd been at Joe's place, helping his wife with dinner and playing with the kids. I just stared at her, dumbfounded. Maggie was also starting to prioritize this new family over her old friends. There was this one time a friend of hers was throwing a party and sent out the invites. Maggie was hemming and hawing about RSVPing. When I asked her what the deal was, she said she was waiting to nail down other plans with Joe and his family. And get this, the plans with them were so vague. They hadn't even decided what they were in, but she was willing to bail on her friend's shindig if it meant being available for Joe's crew. That really rubbed me the wrong way. Things only got weirder from there. I finally got the chance to meet Joe and his family, and it was an encounter I won't soon forget. We all got together at a local park for a casual get-together. As soon as we arrived, Maggie's behavior took a turn that left me completely flabbergasted. Maggie, who had always told me she wasn't a big fan of kids, transformed right before my eyes. She was all over Joe's kids like a doting mother hen. She got down on the floor, without a care for her nice clothes, and started crawling around with the baby. The baby was giggling and reaching out for her, and Maggie was making silly faces and baby noises that had the little one in stitches. The older kid, who was usually quite shy around strangers, barely gave me a second glance. But the moment Maggie showed up, it was like a switch flipped. The kid's eyes lit up, and she practically sprinted over to Maggie, climbing into her lap and hugging her tightly. And what really got me was that the older kid was already calling Maggie Annie. I mean, who does that after just a few weeks? I pulled Maggie aside for a moment and asked her about it, trying to keep my tone light. "Hey, I thought you didn't like babysitting? You seem pretty into these kids," I said, a bit of confusion and concern in my voice. Maggie just shrugged it off and said it was different with Joe's kids. She said she'd babysat for them a couple of times and refused to take any money for it. That was so out of character for her. I knew Maggie well enough to know that she usually avoided anything to do with babysitting like the plague. As the day went on, the conversation took even stranger turns. At one point, Joe and his wife were joking around and made some offhand comment about Maggie coming to live in their basement. They all laughed, but I was just standing there, my mouth agape. What kind of joke was that? It was so out of the blue, and combined with everything else, it just added to my growing sense of unease. Thanksgiving was right around the corner, and Maggie and I had discussed our plans. Since we hadn't been together that long, we decided it would be best to celebrate with our own families. But then Maggie dropped a bombshell. She told me that Joe and his family weren't able to travel far to be with their own relatives, so she had invited them to her parents' house. I was stunned. It was a couple of hours away, and they were all going to sleep over. This wasn't just a casual drop-in. It was a whole weekend affair. When the pictures from Thanksgiving started circulating, I saw one that really made my heart skip a beat. It was a posed photo of Maggie and Joe's family. The older kid was hugging Maggie's shoulders, and they all had these big smiles on their faces. Maggie even made a comment about how she was glad her chosen family could come to Thanksgiving. Chosen family? She barely knew these people. She'd only been at the new job for just under 2 months, and yet she seemed so deeply entrenched in this random family's life. I was really starting to lose my mind over this whole situation. Christmas was approaching, and Maggie was going into overdrive with her attention to Joe's family. She was fretting constantly about what to get the kids for their birthdays and Christmas. It was like she was on a mission to give them the best gifts ever. I watched her pore over catalogs, her brow furrowed in concentration. She'd circle items, make lists, and then cross things off only to add them back again. One evening, she showed me a couple of the presents she'd already bought. There were elaborate toys for the older kid, the kind that came with a million pieces and required hours of assembly. And for the baby, she had a whole set of soft, hand-knitted blankets and cute little outfits. I couldn't help but speak up. Maggie, I don't get it. You've always said you don't like kids that much. Why are you going so overboard for Joe's kids? I've never even seen you this invested in your own nieces and nephews, I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice but failing miserably. Maggie looked at me like I was being ridiculous. It's different with them, she insisted. I've been around to watch them grow, and I'm close to Joe and his wife. These kids are more like family to me, so I treat them differently. They're the exception to the rule. I just stared at her, dumbfounded. It still didn't make any sense to me. Then she dropped another bombshell. She said that in the past, she used to exchange Christmas gifts with Joe and his wife too, but they'd all decided it was too much trouble and unnecessary. So, these days, she usually baked them something or got them a nice bottle of wine. That's when I really started to think something was seriously wrong. If she'd been exchanging gifts with them before, then she couldn't have just met them like I thought. Had she been lying to me this whole time? Or was there something else going on that I was missing? I decided I couldn't just let this slide. I had to get to the bottom of it. The next time I was at Maggie's place, I waited until she was in the shower, and then I quietly started looking through her things. I know it was a bit sneaky, but I was desperate. I didn't find anything incriminating, but then I remembered her Facebook. I pulled out my phone and logged into my own account, then searched for her profile. As I scrolled through her photos, my eyes widened in disbelief. There in plain sight were a ton of pictures with Joe and his wife going back a decade. It was like a whole other life I knew nothing about. I saw photos of them all at college parties, with Maggie wearing a big smile and a silly hat. There were pictures of Joe and Maggie as big brother and little sister in a co-ed frat/sorority. And then there were the ones of Maggie as a bridesmaid in Joe and his wife's wedding, looking stunning in a flowing dress. There were even snapshots of Maggie holding their newborn children, her face filled with joy. It all clicked into place. Maggie hadn't been lying. She hadn't been hiding anything from me. It was all my fault. I have ADHD, and I've always struggled with zoning out when people talk to me for a while. I've been called out on it before, and now I realized it was probably what had happened here. Maggie had most likely told me about Joe and his family, and I just hadn't been listening. I sat there on Maggie's couch, staring at my phone in shock and disbelief, my heart sinking deeper with every passing second. The photos on her Facebook painted a vivid picture of a past I had been completely oblivious to, a history that she had every right to assume I knew. It was like a punch to the gut, realizing how much I had missed simply because I hadn't been fully present in our conversations. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me, so intense it was almost suffocating. How could I have been so careless? Maggie had been sharing parts of her life with me, and I had let it all slip through my fingers like sand. I thought back to all the times she might have mentioned Joe and his family, and now I could see the hazy memories of her voice, talking animatedly about old college days, while my mind had wandered off to who knows where. My hands were shaking as I put my phone away, trying to come to terms with what I had just discovered. I knew I had to face Maggie and admit my mistake, but the thought of it filled me with dread. What if she was so hurt and angry that she decided to end things right then and there? The idea of losing her because of my own foolishness was almost too much to bear. When Maggie finally emerged from the shower, her hair still damp and a towel wrapped around her body, she could immediately sense that something was wrong. The smile on her face faded as she looked at me, and her eyes filled with concern. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Maggie, I need to talk to you," I said, my voice cracking. I gestured for her to sit down next to me, and she did, her eyes never leaving mine. I told her everything. I confessed about how I had gone through her Facebook, how I'd seen the pictures and realized my mistake. I told her about my ADHD and how it had caused me to zone out when she was sharing important parts of her life. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes as I spoke, and I didn't even try to hold them back. Maggie listened quietly, her expression unreadable. When I was finally done, there was a long, heavy silence. I was terrified of what she would say next. But then, to my surprise, she reached out and took my hand. "I'm not going to lie. I'm really hurt that you didn't trust me enough to just ask," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "But I also understand that you have a hard time sometimes. I just wish you had told me about your ADHD sooner. We could have worked on ways to communicate better." Her words were like a balm to my wounded pride. I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, our relationship could survive this. But I knew there was still a long way to go. After that heart-wrenching conversation with Maggie, I knew I had a mountain to climb if I wanted to salvage our relationship. The first and most crucial step was coming to terms with my ADHD and how it had been a silent saboteur in my life, especially when it came to my connection with Maggie. I had been in denial for far too long, brushing off my zoning out episodes as mere distractions. But now, the consequences were staring me right in the face, and I couldn't afford to ignore them any longer. So, the very next day, I embarked on a search for a therapist. It was a daunting task. The thought of baring my soul to a stranger was intimidating, but I pushed through my discomfort, spending hours scouring the internet for reviews, making countless phone calls to inquire about availability and specialties. Finally, I found a therapist who seemed to understand my struggles. My first session was nerve-wracking. As I walked into the cozy, yet somewhat intimidating office, my palms were sweaty and my heart raced. But the therapist's warm smile and gentle demeanor immediately put me at ease. Over the course of several sessions, I delved deep into understanding my ADHD and how it affected my relationships. I learned practical techniques to stay present during conversations. For instance, I started repeating key points in my head like a mental mantra whenever Maggie spoke. I also practiced asking clarifying questions, ensuring that I truly grasped what she was saying. Maggie, bless her heart, was incredibly supportive throughout this process. At my request, she accompanied me to a few sessions. Her presence was reassuring, and it gave her a better understanding of what I was going through. Together, we worked on communication strategies. We established a system where if I felt myself zoning out, I'd give her a gentle squeeze on the hand, a signal that she needed to pause or repeat herself. Slowly but surely, our relationship began to mend. We resumed our walks in the park, but this time, I was fully immersed in the moment. I noticed the vibrant colors of the flowers, the chirping of the birds, and, most importantly, the sound of Maggie's laughter. Our movie nights became more enjoyable as I paid attention to every detail of the film and her reactions to it. One evening, as we were cuddled up on the couch, a bowl of popcorn between us, Maggie turned to me and smiled. Her eyes were filled with warmth and a glimmer of pride. "You know," she said softly, "I can really see the difference in you. I'm proud of you for taking this step." Her words were like a warm embrace, filling me with a sense of accomplishment. I knew there would still be hurdles ahead, but for the first time in what felt like ages, I was confident that we could face them together. I had learned my lesson the hard way, but it had led me to a newfound understanding of myself and a deeper, more resilient bond with Maggie. As we looked to the future, I was filled with anticipation. I was committed to continuous self-improvement and nurturing our relationship. With Maggie by my side, I felt invincible, ready to take on whatever life threw at us.